Have you ever had the desire to simply not exist, to be relieved of the burdens of this human existence? I haven't uploaded in such a long time because recently I've just been feeling the futility of it all. I don't want to die, but if given the choice to be born, I'm not sure I would have taken on this assignment. I don't want an afterlife, I choose nothingness, the eternal abyss instead. I used to think I was the only one in the world that could feel this way. But seeing just how many people related to Bo Burnham's Inside made me realise just how pervasive and common this sentiment actually is.
But if I could kill myself for a year, I'd do it today. If I could kill myself today and be dead until like 18 months from now, I would do it. But alas,
there seems to be something deeply unwell in our societies these days, a sort of casual suicidality, a casual doomerism, where we're all like, yeah, the world is ending, we're all fucked, there's nothing we can do about it, so what's the point? I'm not a mental health professional, but in an attempt to get myself out of this feeling of quiet desperation, I've been exploring the roots of how I and so many people got to this place, and what, if anything, we can do about it. So with that being said, how did we get into this mess? My sense of casual doomerism began, like for many of us, in history class, where I was taught a view of the history of humanity as being a series of wars, conquests, and supremacy of empire. Maybe long ago we lived a life of Edenic bliss, only for it all to be destroyed by our inherent selfish human nature. On top of that, after the Cold War and political scientist Francis Fukuyama's declaration of the end of history, it's pretty common for most of us to assume that we're at the end point of our socio-political evolution. The idea of alternative ways of structuring society kind of seems ludicrous. Psychologists have come to refer to this as the end of history illusion. When we think about the future, we tend to underestimate just how many things might change. Across all age groups, people indicate that even if they've experienced profound change in the past, when they think about the future, they don't foresee that trend continuing. And these days, capitalism is so ingrained in every aspect of our lives that it's hard for many of us to imagine anything else. Someone once said that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. And part of the reason why it's so hard for us to imagine a world without capitalism is because American resistance historiographers have highlighted how those that actually make history by transforming it are largely left out of history books. At root is a veritable obsession on the part of the rulers of the world with ensuring that social movements cannot be seen to grow, to flourish, to propose alternatives, that those who challenge existing power arrangements can never be perceived to win. And it can be hard to imagine any real change happening because, especially with social media, we live in what the philosopher Roman Kreuzneric called the tyranny of the now, a blinkered short-termism. We don't tend to see ourselves in the larger context of history, that we are part of a long chain, that our work does not begin with us, nor will it end with us. I love how the writer Rebecca Solnit put it in her book Hope in the Dark. Amnesia leads to despair in many ways. The status quo would like you to believe it is immutable, inevitable, and invulnerable. And lack of memory of a dynamically changing world reinforces this view. In other words, when you don't know how much things have changed, you don't see that they are changing or that they can change. And I've spoken about before in previous videos, like the BreadTube video, that when we do acknowledge some change, some positive transformation has happened in the past, we usually attribute it to the work of one great man of history, which can leave us average Joes feeling like we just have no agency, no ability to really be able to change anything. Political activist and writer Angela Davis wrote in Freedom is a Constant Struggle, "It is essential to resist the depiction of history as the work of heroic individuals in order for people today to recognize their potential agency as part of an ever-expanding community of struggle." It's also pretty common for people to talk about this period of history as if no other humans have ever felt like we do ever before. We are in a uniquely terrible situation, unlike any other time before. But as the writer Oliver Burkeman pointed out in 4,000 Weeks, if you try searching Google for the phrase "these uncertain times," you'll find that it occurs again and again in hundreds of journals and books in almost every decade, reaching back to the 17th century. So I agree with the writer H.G. Wells that human history is in essence a history of ideas. The stories that we tell ourselves about who we are as humans and our past shapes our present and determines what we think is thinkable and unthinkable, possible and impossible, what actions we end up taking and don't take. And that's why I've been really trying to ask myself, and I think it can be helpful for us all to get curious about what version of history we have internalized. Where did that belief system, story, worldview originate from? Can we be intentional about updating the story we tell ourselves? And from which story are we most effective as an agent of change? It isn't just our view of history that conditions us into learned helplessness. The constant deluge of negative news spreads alarmism, fear-mongering, sensationalism, drowning us in anxiety and despair.
Today's top headlines: everything you do is futile.
And whilst people in the past could usually limit their intake of news to one small snippet of the day, now social media algorithms, incentivized by negative news that keeps us hooked to our screens, expose us to near constant rates of increasingly controversial, devastating, and shocking news over time, so that we literally never get a break from feeling the weight of the world's problems on our shoulders.
It used to be that people waited for the evening newscast or for the morning newspaper to get their dose of fear. Now they get it on their phones constantly.
All of this can lead us to feel like the world is this dark, horrible place, and to empathy fatigue. Like sometimes I really feel I don't care anymore because I'm just so numbed out and desensitized from all the overexposure. We're also constantly fed dystopian images of the future via media like Squid Game, Black Mirror, Don't Look Up, Handmaid's Tale, which makes the future seem bleak and diffuses energy for change because things could always be worse.
The entire planet is about to be destroyed.
Disaster movies and doomsday apocalypse narratives continue to portray humanity as brutish, nasty, savage, and hysterical in the face of catastrophe, despite the fact that decades of sociological research shows us that the prevalent human nature in disaster is resilient, resourceful, generous, empathetic, and brave. We also tend to exclusively speak of the consequences of crisis as trauma and eternal victimhood, giving us the impression that humanity is unbearably fragile, failing to acknowledge that many people experience crisis as an opportunity for what psychologists have come to term post-traumatic growth. And then there's also the education system, which breeds hopelessness. When I was at school, Animal Farm and 1984 had been mandatory parts of the curriculum in the UK to teach the dangers of socialist ideology and make us afraid to pursue change. And I'm sure a lot of you can relate that imagination and creativity were also stamped out of me and my peers from a very early age, making it difficult to have the imaginative muscles necessary to envision, let alone create, a better world. I studied social anthropology in my undergraduate degree. I was so excited about this degree because it shows us that in other times and places, humans have lived entirely differently, and that the possibilities are literally endless as to how humans can reshape society. But after my first year, I ended up switching to major in international relations because I bought into the propagandizing that anthropology was the least employable, least important degree that exists. I went to university with all these dreams to change the world and maybe be an anthropologist studying Indigenous communities across the globe and to become a writer someday, only to spend most of my adult life slaving away at jobs I hate, barely making ends meet. I should make clear that this is not my home, I'm just the housekeeper here temporarily. And I think the writer Lauren Berlin really hit the nail on the head when she called this a form of cruel optimism. Like, a lot of us were fed this idea that we could be and do anything that we want in our lives. And this illusion of infinite possibility is exhausting, making us all feel like failures, collapsing us into the depressed opposite that nothing is possible. And of course, this idea of dreaming big is never about collective pursuits. Ever since the Reagan-Thatcher era and the reign of neoliberalism, society has become increasingly individualistic, where we are all encouraged to be a competitive, self-starting entrepreneur, a space where solidarity and empathy are only dangerous distractions, weakening the warrior that you are obliged to be. In this context, the idea of us all coming together to create a better world kind of seems ludicrous. I think the anthropologist David Graeber perfectly summarised what I've been trying to say when he wrote, "Hopelessness isn't natural, it needs to be produced. If we really want to understand this situation, we have to begin by understanding that the last 30 years have seen the construction of a vast bureaucratic apparatus for the creation and maintenance of hopelessness." So some questions that I've been trying to remind myself to ask myself when I feel this intense doomerism and futility of everything. Who benefits from us being stricken with despair? How are the things that we give our attention to adding or taking away from our sense of agency? Why do we engage with the stuff that gets us feeling doomeristic and all stirred up? Whatever reason we might tell ourselves, like the desire to be informed, maybe the real reason is a lot deeper, like in my case, the desire to seem intelligent or the desire to justify my political passivity. How might we be able to alter our consumption habits to better reflect reality? Part of what keeps me glued to negative world events is that it keeps me in a hypervigilant state, always on guard, always on the defense, anticipating wrongdoings, planning for the future in a misguided attempt at safety and control in my life. It's like I feel if I plan for hurt, then I'll be prepared for it, and then maybe it won't be so painful. But I'm realizing in doing this, I'm subconsciously creating neural pathways of despair. Decades of research on the phenomenon of self-fulfilling prophecy teaches us that beliefs about ourselves and others come true. If we constantly fill our brains with information and thoughts about how people suck and the world sucks, then we're likely to recreate that reality in our lives. Whereas if we respond to ourselves and others as beautiful creatures with so much to give and so much capability and believe in the possibility of change, the more we live that into reality and the more that we see it all around us, which further reinforces that belief.
If the premise that I started with is accurate, that we create a self-fulfilling prophecy based off of whatever we believe, what would we do to a planet that we believed we were unworthy of? Will we create the conditions to be ejected from it? We would create the conditions to be expelled from it again and again and again. We are living in the projections of our unworthiness.
So sometimes we have to change our beliefs to change our experiences. And of course, that's so much easier said than done. Psychologists in 2021 actually came up with the term addiction to doom scrolling. So I definitely don't want to make light of the fact that this can be a serious mental health issue for many people. Whilst for other people, it might really be as simple as just making the decision to change a belief.
Time is wasted waiting for certainty. Sometimes belief is a decision. There's no flash of light, no visit from the future. The data is fundamentally flawed, and it's a bright day in March, and you decide to believe in the goodness of man.
But for most people who, like me, fall somewhere between the two extremes, I think changing beliefs can be a bit more of an intentional daily practice. I find ethnographer Kristen Godsey's work on everyday utopia really helpful here. She talks about how hope isn't just a random emotion, it's also a habit, a skill to build, a muscle to strengthen. Our attention determines our reality. what we focus on grows. And so one of the ways we can tackle doomerism and train the muscle of hope is via things like hope journaling, mental mapping, setting clear goals, visualizing, and mustering the willpower to pursue them in the face of obstacles and disappointments. The more we hope, the better we become at hoping, and the more that we inspire others who then inspire us in turn, it's contagious, like a virtuous cycle. So some questions that I've been asking myself in relation to all of this is, in what ways can I embolden myself in small daily ways to build neural pathways of hope? What would it look like to practice liberation on a daily basis? And to borrow the writer and poet Sonia Renee Taylor's brilliant question,
what is the unknown but probable beauty that I can live into every single day in a small way that expands my capacity to hold the unknown, probable magnificence of a collective future?
And I do want to make clear that I am very aware that it's a lot easier for people like me who are relatively privileged to be hopeful. But that being said, as a survivor of CSA, I am very aware of the darkest, most disturbing things human beings are capable of. But I remember when I was about 12 years old, really making the active decision that I didn't want to live in that place anymore. I didn't want that worldview to be my reality. And I don't always succeed at that, hence why I'm struggling right now. But I am constantly, intentionally challenging myself in my beliefs about humanity and what is possible in our futures. I may not have a choice as to the terrible things that happen to me and happen in the world, but I do have a choice as to where I put my attention and to be inspired by the good, and to surround myself by people who see the best in me and inspire me to live that into being. I want to end this part of the video with my favourite example of someone living the self-fulfilling prophecy into being, the Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, who had every reason to believe in humanity as terrible.
You won't believe it. Gray hair, my age, I started taking flying lessons recently. Do you know what my flying instructor told me? If you are starting here, wish to get here, say east, heading for this, and you have a crosswind, you will drift and you will land here. So you have to do what we pilots call crabbing, he told me, C-R-A-B, crabbing. You have to head for north of this airfield, and you have to fly that way, you see, as if you headed in this direction. If you are heading here above this airfield, then you will actually land here. But if you head for here, you are landing here. This holds also for man, I would say. If we take man as he really is, we make him worse. But if we overestimate him, it's premature, your applause, you will soon know why. If we seem to be idealists and are overestimating, overrating man, and looking at him that high, here above, you know what happens? We promote him to what he really can be. So we have to be idealists in a way, because then we'll wind up as the true, the real realists. And you know who has said this? If we take man as he is, we make him worse. But if we take man as he should be, we make him capable of becoming what he can be. This was not my flight instructor, this was not me, this was Goethe. He said this verbally. And now you will understand why I, in one of my writings, once said, this is the most apt maxim and motto for any psychotherapeutic activity.
Philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "He who fights too long against dragons becomes a dragon himself, and if you gaze too long into the abyss will gaze into you." I think far too many of us spend all of our time as dragons, staring into the abyss, tearing each other down, finding everyone lacking, fueling our doomerism. We have a rebuttal for every suggested course of action.
Sign a petition, performative useless activism, support an NGO, what, and contribute to the infamous NGO industrial complex. Join a protest and you'll be crushed.
We're always on high alert. Is it revolutionary enough? Will it be co-opted? Is it problematic? It's like we're going through the motions of trying to make the world a better place, secretly thinking it's all futile. Don't get me wrong, I think radical critique is an indispensable weapon. It's crucially important. If you see yourself as a critical theorist, that's great. I've done a lot of that on my channel as well. But I also think it can be a recipe for doomerism and inaction, because constant negativity can make us apathetic and be counterproductive. As the humanist Thomas More pointed out in Utopia, this marginal position not only renders persuasion more difficult, but paradoxically reinforces the centrality of the norm. The margins, by their very definition, are bound to the centre, and the critic, in their act of criticism, reinscribes the importance of the world they take issue with. So given that constant critique isn't actually that helpful a lot of the time, I would argue that a lot of the motivation behind this critique mode is less about making the world a better place and more about satisfying some unmet psychological need. Speaking from personal experience, to be part of the in-group of radicals constantly critiquing everything can give us a sense of belonging. It's that classic schools stuff where we feel part of something by constantly othering others. Or we might believe that doomerism, cynicism, negativity are the fuel that drive us to action. We are afraid that embracing hope, joy, fun might result in inaction. Or sometimes critique is coming from the fear of rejection and the terror of betrayal. It's easier and more comfortable to criticize other people's ideas than to have our own ideas debated and ridiculed. Or maybe we are longing for approval, to be the one that understands the world's problems, anticipates and exposes wrongdoing, can make us feel smart, dominant, superior, better than all those other normies who just don't get it. Or maybe we've simply internalized this hierarchical, competitive, capitalistic mentality that it's hard for us to relate to ourselves and each other outside of critique. So I think it can be really useful here to get curious about what is at the root of our critique mode. Could constant cynicism and critique be sheltering a hidden wound? In my case, I realized constant critique and cynicism is a form of self-protection. When it's too difficult for me to deal with the trauma of my childhood, I can deflect from my own pain by hyperfixating on the problems in the world. Recognizing what lies at the root of our cynicism and negativity can then make it easier for us to ask and see what within ourselves needs healing in order for us to let go of critique mode and see what emerges in its place. If I'm really honest, there are times where I don't actually want the world to get better. I think a large part of this is because of toxic shame, my biggest mental health struggle to this day. Toxic shame is the deeply ingrained belief that there is something inherently unlovable, unworthy, or defective about us. In my case, toxic shame was a big part of my attraction to wanting to make the world a better place. As a kid, I was made to feel I was bad, a disappointment and burden, so I desperately wanted to make a difference in the world to prove that I am good. This could sustain activism for a while and temporarily assuage my shame, only to make me feel more afraid of being found out, that people would realize I'm not actually a good person. And this is a deeply exhausting and doomer-inducing place to be. The more I fear being found out, the more hopeless and negative I become. I actually made a whole video on Patreon about my relationship to shame because I think this is an interesting topic in and of itself for anyone who's interested or can relate in any way. I will link the video below. But the main reason that I bring up shame is because I think there's actually a lot of people like me who are motivated to change the world who are actually incredibly shame-bound, because a lot of the attempts to change people and the world rely on shame to drive us to action. We tell everyone we're not doing enough, we need to be doing more. We use slogans like "you're either part of the solution or part of the problem" to guilt us into action. We proclaim the complicity of every single one of us in white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. We use cancel culture to publicly shame each other. We're always made to feel individually responsible for all the problems in the world. And we're even made to feel shame about our doomerism.
Newsflash, don't you realize that the things you are afraid will happen to you are already happening to the most marginalized in the world? How dare you be a doomer? You're so privileged. Don't you know that despair is just a form of apathy?
There may absolutely be truth to these views, but usually this just results in self-flagellation, like I'm such a self-pitying piece of shit, which just reinforces the doomerism and despair even more. And going off of John Bradshaw's brilliant book, Healing the Shame That Binds You, the more shame that we have, the more we internalize we deserve to be punished. So for me and my fellow shame-bound people, a lot of the time we don't actually want the world to get better for us or people like us because we think we deserve it. We also know that shame is a key determinant of crime in the world. Going back to the self-fulfilling prophecy, the more that we think we are bad, the more that can lead us to actually do bad in the world. So we may hurt, dominate, or control other people, which further reinforces a dark worldview. So I would suggest, and something I'm very much trying to do myself, is becoming sensitive to our relationship to shame, how it might drive the work we do in the world, and in what ways doomerism might be a manifestation of our internalized shame. There are times I almost long for apocalypse because it's the ultimate escape fantasy. This world I find so oppressive and hopeless is soon to be destroyed, my enemies punished. Faced with the constant onslaught of negativity in the world, there can be something so soothing about thinking it will all soon end. The possibility of creating a better world can actually be harder to deal with than deciding apocalypse is inevitable, because the latter lets us off the hook from having to do anything. It's tacitly a way of avoiding action. We can continue business as usual because there's no real hope of change, so what's the point in even trying? Whereas to recognize our agency and the malleability of the world actually requires us to do something. Someone commented on my video about reclaiming our gifts, that my gifts terrify me. And I think there is so much truth to that, because we are afraid to dream of a better life or a better world because we are afraid of our potential, and we are afraid to do the work required to live into our potential. Something that really hammers this point home is one of my all-time favourite quotes, and it comes from the writer Marianne Williamson when she says, "Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us." Possibility can also be more terrifying than apocalypse, because apocalypse gives us a sense of control. We have a blueprint for how the future will turn out, rather than the unpredictable uncertainty of not knowing what the future might bring. Possibility can open us up to the wound of crushed idealism and betrayed hopes. I still remember how my childhood wonder and excitement and joy gave way to an adulthood of deferred dreams and lowered expectations. Perhaps we would rather believe in the inevitability of apocalypse than opening ourselves up to the tender, vulnerable hopefulness that could easily be crushed, as it has so many times before. Possibility of change for the better can also be more painful than the idea of apocalypse, because it forces us to confront all the things we didn't but should have received, all the suffering we endured that wasn't necessary. I think the writer and performer Alok put this so beautifully in a We Can Do Hard Things episode when they were discussing how their grandma reacted to their trans identity.
When she said, "How could you do this to me?" what she's also saying is, how could you show me that freedom is possible? Because it's easier. It's easier to believe that this prison is a home. It's easier to believe that this misery is the only way to live. And in watching and witnessing you own your own body, I have to confront the ways in which I've outsourced that ownership to other people, to culture, to identity.
So the invitation here is to ask ourselves, in what ways, if any, does apocalypse appeal to us? What is our relationship to possibility? And as Sonia Renee Taylor puts it, how are you colluding with impossibility? So the core of what I've been trying to say in this video is that when I have the desire to simply not exist, I've been trying with love, accountability and understanding to self-investigate my Doomerism and its root systems. In what ways is Doomerism living within me? How did it get there? Where did it come from? What beliefs about Doomerism are a product of my indoctrination into this culture and not the truth? In what ways do I allow this to govern the work that I do and the ways that I see the world? Is my story of humanity as doomed obscuring something within me I am unwilling to see? How might the world be mirroring back to me my own inner apocalypse and inner oppression? What are the sources of my resistance to hope? What within myself needs healing so I can allow space for utopia? The point of all these questions is not to self-flagellate ourselves for the ways Doomerism manifests in our lives. It's more about getting curious about the ways it presents, its origins and its impacts. With self-compassion, there's no pressure that we need to change anything. It's only an invitation to inquire into the what, why and how of beliefs that don't serve us. For the things that come up for us, no one can tell us how to respond. I think that wisdom comes more from listening and being present to what emerges. So I'm really not interested in replacing Doomerism with a vision of utopia or handing out instructions and fixed ways of being to direct the course of struggle for a better world. I'm more interested in when we unpeel all the layers of Doomerism and cynicism and oppression that make us contort ourselves and lose ourselves, a portal opens up to what the poet Maya Angelou called the Inviolate Place, a place that is sacred. In the core of us, the deepest, quietest, most disavowed parts of ourselves, we know what makes us come most alive, what path we need to take, what gifts we have to bring, what we are here at this time on this planet to create, to give to the collective. It's about getting so connected to that part of ourselves that the things that try to squash us and shrink us and disempower us and fill us full of doomerism and nihilism cannot be allowed to continue to thrive. And I think this is courageous work, to listen to that inner knowing, carry it forward and act upon it amidst all the voices that tell us it's crazy or stupid or impossible is no easy task. This journey can be incredibly difficult because most of us harbour an inner cynic and inner doomer who, echoing the words of our dominant cultures, tells us,
don't be naive and ridiculous and waste time on self-reflection.
My own inner critic is always telling me, you're just promoting individualistic solutions when what we need is systemic change. But I truly think this work of finding our soul work is about the collective, because in order to heal humanity, we need to stay rooted in who we are and what we bring, and to do the works our bodies, minds, hearts are called to. As I mentioned earlier, I hadn't uploaded in such a long time because I was so disconnected from what gifts I have to bring. But ever since reconnecting to this deep sense that I am a writer and researcher and video maker and a facilitator of transformative justice, I've been once again full of so much joy and hope and a sense of purpose. We need hands-on healers moving pain out of our bodies. We need parents raising children in radical new ways. We need ecologists reclaiming ancient ways of tending to the earth. We need organisers of mass protests and direct action, music makers and deep listeners. We need each of us fulfilling our unique and specific role and contribution to the world.
All I know is to trust what is called forth from me at any time. That is my job, and that's everyone's job, to ask, what is mine to do right now? What am I to say? And we have an internal guidance system that can bring us to the right action and the right speech. And it's a guidance system that we are not really in the habit of listening to. In fact, we've been trained to override it, to not listen to it. So to recover it maybe takes some time and some practice. To recover trust in your desires.
No matter how terrible external conditions might become, we can hold on to that sense of who we are and what we are here for. It gives us the strength to persevere and navigate through these challenges. We can be more discerning about what voices and influences we allow in. We can direct our attention to the work that is ours to do and let the rest go. The external conditions might never change, but our intentionality and our focus changes. This is why I believe the poet and writer Audre Lorde said that the best remedy to the onslaught of negative news is to find your work and do it. And why the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." And why Viktor Frankl, after surviving Auschwitz, said that retaining a sense of meaning and purpose was in many cases decisive in terms of who lived and who died.
Meaning is the most important thing in our lives?
Certainly, because what I call a will to meaning, the wish to find and to fulfill meaning, is the basic motivation in human beings.
Now this void manifests itself as
in apathy, in boredom, lack of initiative, lack of interest in the world, or initiative in changing something within the world for the better. This frustration is a proof of the existence of a will to meaning. Unless we were imbued by will to meaning, by the wish to find meaning and discover and fulfill meaning in life, we never would be able to experience an inner void. So this is in a way also something positive.
In order for systems of oppression to thrive, they need to constantly crush and subdue the forces of transformation for us not to dream or try to be separated from our capacities to believe in humanity as doomed. So to listen to our inviolate place, to trust it and follow its instructions is profoundly revolutionary. It's honestly been my greatest healer, teacher, and antidote to my desire to simply not exist. So I want to leave you with 2 questions. Have you found your inviolate place? And when was the last time you went there to listen? Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me. I'd really appreciate if you could consider becoming a patron to help support this channel, as these videos take a lot of time, energy, and resources to create. On Patreon, we have a Discord and we have regular Discord calls about every 2 to 3 weeks. We have a book club. I also upload Patron-only videos where I talk more casually once per month. Like I said, the last one was about shame. I also contribute writing and research-wise to Positive Leftist News, which is another channel which the name is on the tin. It spreads positive news about the world, which can also be an antidote to Doomerism. I'll link that too in the description box below. I'll also leave reading lists of books I would recommend, but also are an antidote to Doomerism in the description. And finally, I'd also recommend my videos on reclaiming radical hope and eco-grief and creativity, because they are also talking about very similar topics. I'll link these videos on the screen above.